Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here today to continue my series on why I picked an AK for my multi-role rifle. This is a project that developed kind of in recognition of the weirdness that has been 2020 and seems to be continuing into 2021. A lot of people have found themselves as being first-time gun owners this year. There's been a lot of concerns just about security in general this year that have made a lot of people go out and get guns for the first time. And a lot of people are getting guns with multiple concerns in mind, multiple roles that they want to fulfill. And so I thought I would document my process on putting together a multi-role rifle so that people would have something kind of to compare and contrast to. I'm not saying that this particular rifle is the best for everyone. It's not going to be, because everybody's needs are going to be a little bit different. I'm also not even saying that it's necessarily the best for me. It's just the best of what I had available at the time. It works. And that's what this video series has been about. Trying to get kind of a big picture idea of things that you need to think about when setting up a multi-role gun. A gun that can address multiple concerns. In my particular case, I started out the series by saying, okay, what are my roles? And briefly, the four roles that I picked up, if you want a more in-depth explanation of roles and the kind of decision-making that goes on to it, I suggest you watch the first video. But I said that for me, I want four things. Four roles for my rifle to fulfill. One, I want it to be plinkable in 2020 and now 2021 for a wide variety of people, meaning relatively cheap to shoot and relatively easy to shoot. The second role I wanted is something that would work as a bedside gun, something that I could leave by the bedside, as the name implies, and it would be there ready to go if something happened in the apartments where I felt that I was under threat of my life, or at least grave bodily harm. If there was some kind of a home invasion or something like that, would I be able to protect myself? And for those of you who don't know, I tend to travel a lot, and I do have a traveling bedside gun. This one's a little big for that. But when you're out and about, and especially when you're in a strange place at night, having something by your bedside just in case something happens does help you sleep a little bit better at night, just to be honest. The third role that I wanted it to fulfill had to do with the fact that this year, well, last year and going into this year, we've seen some weird things happen with the supply chain in general. And there are some parts of the supply chain that are still kind of being affected. And I got to thinking, if the normal supply chain of how we get things is disrupted enough, I might find myself in a situation where the normal way in which I go and get food at the grocery store and whatnot might not be a viable option anymore. I need a way to put food on the table myself. And so I said, having a rifle that can also work as the hunting implements is a good thing to have. So something that can take, kind of medium to large game, something around the size of a deer, at 200 yards, which is typical for this area. I have lots of friends who hunt. I'm not really a hunter, but I have lots of friends who hunt, and all of them were able to fulfill deer tags this year, and all of them took their deer at 200 yards or less. That's fairly typical for this area. It's going to vary from area to area and from game animal to game animal, but for my area, for a lot of the deer that are around here, 200 yards and in is pretty typical. So something that can take basically a deer-sized animal at 200 yards or less. And then last but not least, I said something that, if things get bad enough, and we've seen that happen in 2020, and who knows what 2021 holds for us, but we've seen some situations in certain cities where riots and mobs and looting and that kind of thing happens. And having something that could help me deal with that kind of situation, or at least get out of that kind of a situation if I happen to find myself there, that would be reassuring. So those were the four roles that I picked. In the next video, after that first one where I talked about the roles, I went on to basically the next step. Okay, so at first I said, okay, here's what I want it to do. Next I said, well, what bullet is going to help me accomplish that? In my personal opinion, the bullet is more important than the gun. The gun is just the bullet thrower, but it's the bullet that actually accomplishes whatever task or tasks, the multiple roles of a multi-role gun that you're trying to accomplish. So picking your bullets is, in a lot of ways, more important than picking the gun. There's usually many different kinds of guns that will shoot a particular caliber. And you can usually get, a gun that's close enough to whatever you want. But if you don't make a good decision regarding the caliber, you can find yourself in kind of a bad way. My biggest considerations for the caliber I picked, this is a fairly typical AK, so it shoots 7.62 by 39. The reason why I picked that caliber is primarily two roles that I had in mind. One, I wanted it to be plinkable in 2020 and now going into 2021. So it had to be a relatively inexpensive round, but that third role that I had picked, something that I could use to take fairly large game out to 200 yards, meant it had to pack a little bit of a punch. So it had to be fairly cheap, but it also had to be fairly effective, not at super long range, but kind of medium shortish range. And so I wound up with 7.62 by 39. Not super inexpensive, but relatively inexpensive. Still fairly commonly available, kind of sort of ish, at least compared to everything else. And it's not super powerful, but it's powerful enough for the main concerns that I have. So that's what I wound up with. Different people are going to have different concerns. You're going to have to give a lot of thought to that, but that's what I wound up with. Then after that I said, okay, now that I've picked the caliber, what caliber thrower, what bullet thrower am I going to pick to shoot that caliber? And so I went over the basic options that were available for 7.62 by 39, and the reality of the situation of there are only so many guns that were available in 2020, especially readily available to me as someone who's usually out and about working most of the time. There were relatively few options, and one of the options that was available was Palmetto State Armory, because you can order them online and have them shipped to your local FFL. And for me, that was the viable option, and so that's what I wound up with. It shot the right caliber, and it was something that was available, and the feature set on AKs is not perfect. Okay, they're not going to be as accurate, say, as ARs or as ergonomic, etc. But they shoot the right caliber. They're a relatively well-known, well-tried design, and so even if the one that you get happens to be a little wonky, a lot of times you can fix them relatively easily, which is kind of what I wound up doing with this one. Wasn't bad, wasn't horrible. There's definitely been worse guns out there, but I did have to do a little bit of tweaking to it to get it to run right, and now it runs fantastically well. Suitable for all the basic things that I wanted it to do. It had detachable magazines, which is different from, like, say, an SKS or something like that. Not perfect, but I could check all the boxes that fulfilled all the roles, so that's what I went with. In the next video after that, I talked about why I went with the full length version, because this has a full 16-inch barrel on it. Why didn't I go with, say a 10.5-inch barrel, or maybe one of the little 7.5-inch barrels, etc. And a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that had to do with the hunting application. If I want something that I can hunt with out to 200 yards relatively easily, I don't want to have to hold over the target too terribly much and kind of guess where it's going to hit, because that's the problem with short barrels. The shorter the barrel, the less velocity, and the less velocity, the more you're going to kind of have to lob the bullet in there to get to the target. And, well, I already have vision problems. Having to pick a different holdover spot and kind of figure out how all that is going to be is not exactly ideal. So a full-length barrel, a little bit higher velocity, it makes the aiming process substantially easier. Especially if I'm going to stay within 200 yards, with this setup, it's basically point and shoot. I don't really have to worry about holdovers in that distance with this barrel length. If I went with a shorter barrel length, especially depending on how short I go, I might have to start worrying about holdovers within 200 yards even. So that was kind of why I did that. And then in the last video that I did in this series, I talked about small upgrades that you can make to your gun. A lot of us in 2020 and going into 2021 now, we got guns because we had concerns. Hopefully we got guns that addressed all or most of those concerns, but a lot of times they're not perfect. But there are a lot of times small things that you can do that will make them better. For example, this is just one example in the video I talked about more, but one example is this enhanced safety. This safety has a little shelf that means I can use my index finger to move it. The standard safety that this gun came with didn't have this little shelf on it, which means to activate the safety I actually had to break my grip all the way and then come over and actually physically move the safety lever down, which was a pain. and not very efficient for pretty much any practical purpose. This little enhanced safety, this little shelf here did cost me some money, but not nearly as much as the gun. It was about 40 bucks. So not nearly as much as the gun, not even as much as a box of ammo these days, which is a sad story. And depending on what kind of ammo you're getting. If it's the cheap leaker stuff, yeah, you can get it for less than that. But if you're trying to go for premium defensive loads or hunting rounds or something like that, yeah. Well, I guess depending on a box of how many. If you're talking about a box of 50, yeah. But not overly expensive, certainly not as expensive as the entire gun. It's a relatively easy change to make. Swapping out the safeties on these guns is really easy, and it makes it a whole lot more functional for me. Okay, something small, not overly expensive, but it is on task. It helps me accomplish my roles. It's good. In this video, I wanted to at least introduce the issue of the sighting system that you're going to pick for your gun. And that can be a very, very, very big and involved discussion. And frankly, I'm trying to keep these videos relatively short, like 20-25 minutes, and there's no way in that time frame that I'm going to be able to talk about everything with sighting systems that I want to get in there. So in this one, all that I'm really going to have the time to do is introduce, if you will, the basic categories of sights. In later videos, I'm going to wind up having to do this as a multi-parter. I'll go into a little bit more detail on them, a little bit more detail and a little bit more fuller evaluation. But right now, just because I don't want this to be overly long, I'm just going to introduce the 6 basic types of sighting systems. Okay. A lot of people, when they first go in to get guns, they're not really aware of the variety that is out there, and frankly it can be really daunting. And so it helps to have at least a kind of a basic minimal level of, okay, what is there, what does it kind of sort of look like. I don't have every single type here available to show you, but I'm going to show you some of them just to help you guys out a little bit. The first kind of sighting system is a sighting system that usually does come with the gun. There are a few guns, especially AR-15s, that don't have them on there, but almost all of the other guns come with what are called open sights. And these are very conventional, tried and true, they've been used forever. Sights on this particular gun, it is this little blade with a notch in it in the back, and up front there is a little post that's protected by these little wings, and that is the sighting system. So I point the gun, I line up the post with the notch, try to make sure that everything's level and straight, make sure it's lined up with the target, and that's how I aim. Basic aiming system that has been used forever and a day, and it can be very effective, but it does have some distinct limitations. For one, you'll notice that here in my apartment with relatively low light, it's kind of hard to pick out that notch and that post. You can kind of see the post. The notch is a little bit hard to pick out. And then if I move the gun over and point it at something that's dark in the background, it's really, really, really hard, especially because I'm trying to see things backwards in the camera, but it can be very, very difficult to actually pick up these dark colored open sights against a dark background. So low lighting levels can be a problem for them, depending on what background you're shooting against can be a problem. And then I also have eye issues, and in fact my eye issues are so bad that if I don't have my glasses on and I try to use open sights, well, that's pretty much useless, because I can see the rear sight, but I actually can't make out the front sight. It's basically just a gray blob out there. That's how bad my eyes are. I'm very nearsighted without my glasses on. And so open sights, while they can be very effective, and there are several people out there who can pretty easily shoot a fairly small target, even at 400 yards with one, sometimes a lot more. Even though they can be very effective, depending on your particular limitations, depending on the ambient light, depending on what color background you're shooting against, they kind of leave much to be desired. And because of that, most people that are serious about shooting, that might not be a very good way to say it, but we'll say a lot of people that have more concerns than just having a functional gun, that want to optimize their gun a little bit more, are usually going to go for something else other than just open sights. Lots of studies have been done both by militaries and by civilian sources, like say firearms instructors and whatnot, that have all confirmed that if you use some kind of an optical system other than open sights, you almost always improve your hit probability. And depending on the sight that you're using, a lot of times you'll also improve your speed to first shot. And in a defensive situation, your speed to first shot is usually what makes or breaks the situation. It determines whether or not you are going to live or die. And so having something that is faster to get on target and something that allows you to get hits more confidently and more accurately is a good thing. So that was the first kind of sighting system of the 6 sighting systems, was open sights. The other 5 almost always give you some kind of an improvement, at least an improvement in accuracy, and with some of them also an improvement in speed. Okay. By the way, all of these guns have been checked and cleared off screen, just in case you're wondering. But one of the first most basic kinds of sights that you can get into that are nice because they're relatively low cost and they also come in a variety of shapes and sizes are these little red dot sights. This particular one, because it's so small and because of the fact that it doesn't have a back lens on it, it's open in the back, is usually called a reflex sight. That's just a subcategory of red dot sights. These are electrical sights that take a very small LED light and they shine it against this front lens, and there's a dot that gets reflected back into the eye. But you can still see through that front lens. It's semi-reflective, but you can still see through it. I'm going to try to see if I can show you guys what this looks like here. There you go. That is a red dot sight. You can look through it. You can still see the target, and you can see your aiming point together. And unlike the open sights that I showed you where you had a rear sight and a front sight that you had to line up, all that you have to do is find the dot and then put the dot on whatever you want to shoot and pull the trigger. Fairly fast and fairly easy to use. Most red dot sights don't have any kind of magnification built into them. You can add magnification. There are these things called magnifiers, which magnify things. And what you do with magnifiers is you put your red dot sight up front, and then you usually put the magnifier behind it, and that allows you to kind of zoom in on faraway things if you want to. But the nice thing about red dot sights is that they don't change basically what you're seeing. Everything is at the same level of magnification, so if you need to be really fast, something that's not going to distort what you're looking at is nice. And red dot sights don't have much distortion, and they're very simple and easy to use. A lot of them have very good battery life as well. You don't have to worry about replacing the battery, except for, like, you know, once a year is a good habit, but a lot of them will go even further than once a year. There are some of them that have gone more than 5 years, and there's a few of them that at least potentially could go up to 10 years. I don't know if anyone's actually taken them that far yet, but at least a year, if not more. This particular one is rated at 100,000 hours for battery life. I tend to like to have the red dot pretty high up in terms of how bright it is, and part of that is just having bad eyes, and so that'll cut down the total battery life. For me, I usually figure out at half of whatever the advertised rating is what I can rely on. So if it's 100,000 that it's advertised at, then I can probably bank on having at least 50,000 hours, with the brightness being where I like it. The manufacturers, they test with kind of a medium level setting, and they say, okay, this is the battery life. I usually turn it up higher than that, and so it doesn't last as long. But still, 50,000 hours is still a really long time. Like I said, these ones are usually relatively inexpensive that you get into. Most of them are going to cost somewhere between $200 and $600 for a decent one. This particular one was a little under $300, and they're very simple to use. They don't magnify things, they don't distort things. They tend to work well in different lighting conditions. I can even use them without my glasses on, which is really nice. Oh no, my glasses fell. but I can use it even without the glasses on. I can still pick up the dot, can still see things well enough to get general shapes and figure out where, you know, center mass is and all those kinds of things. So red dot sights are good. A sighting system that is very similar to red dots is called a holographic sight, and I don't have one to show you guys, and that's because they tend to be a little on the expensive side, and they also tend to be a little bulky. And they also don't have super great battery life. So why would anyone get them? Well, the nice thing about holographic sights is that the sight picture that they give you is usually a little bit clearer and a little bit more refined. And so if you're someone who wants to make fairly precise shots, they can be really good for that. And they also, in some ways, are a little bit more durable and a little bit more forgiving. With sights, there's this thing called eye box, which is basically where you can have your eye relative to where the sight is. You know, do I have to be right behind the sight, or can I be off to the side a little bit, up, down, whatever? And holographic sights tend to have a very forgiving eye box. Red dots are pretty good. Holographic sights are even better, a little bit more precise. If you have vision problems, the holographic sights will oftentimes appear a little bit clearer, just because they're a little bit more refined. But my problem with them is that they're out of my price range. They start at $400 and go up from there. And also, they don't have a super long battery life, usually around 1,000 hours-ish, which is a long time. But I don't want to have to worry about changing out batteries that often, so I just go with stuff that has much longer battery life, like conventional red dots, and I kind of make do with that. But holographic sights that are out there. They're very similar to red dots, technically higher performance in terms of clarity and eye box and things like that, but it does come at a cost in terms of being a little bit bulkier, usually a little bit more expensive, and low battery life. Alright, after red dots and holographic sights, the next kind of sight is the prism sight. And this, go ahead and tell you right now, this is actually the kind of sight that I wound up picking for my AK. And the reason why I picked this one in particular, this is the Primary Arms GLX 2X prism sight. The reason why I picked this one is because it works basically best for my roles with my eyes. Like I said, if I take off my glasses, I can't see open sights, and so I need something that I can see even without my glasses on. And the nice thing about this particular prism sight is that it has an illuminated reticle, and it also has an insanely long battery life for a prism sight. Prism sights usually don't have very long battery life, but this one actually has pretty long battery life, at least for a prism sight. This one has about 20,000 hours of battery life, which for me means about 10,000 hours, which is about a year. And for me, that's good enough. So much better battery life than a holographic sight. Not as good as a red dot, but the nice thing about prism sights is that they work really well for people with astigmatism, which I have. With a red dot sight, my best group size shooting at 100 yards is about 3.5 inches, which is not great. Going with a prism sight, though, my best group size at 100 yards is about 1.25 inches. So it is a substantial improvement. Now, I do kind of not like the fact that this one is as small as it is, but the trade-off of having a relatively small one is that if you have one that's battery powered, the battery tends to last longer. You know, smaller reticle, smaller illumination, doesn't tend to eat up as much battery, so really long battery life. Reticle is kind of small, but it works out well. Let me go ahead and show you guys what it looks like in there. So you can see it looks very similar to the red dot when the reticle is on, but what is cool about this one is that there is some magnification. Not all prism sights offer magnification. Some of them are what are called 1x sights. They don't offer any magnification, but they're very, very, very clear, and they work well for people with astigmatism. This one does have a little bit of magnification. It is a 2x, so it makes things twice as big when you look through the lens. And another thing that is cool about prism sights is that even if you turn the reticle off, there will actually still be a visible reticle there because it's actually etched into the glass. It'll be hard to pick up in low light, and especially if you have it against a dark background, but it will technically still work. So even if I happen to forget to change the battery at this thing, on this thing at the end of the year, I still have a workable reticle in there, which is a really handy thing to have. So it has decent battery life. It works well for people with astigmatism. When I have the reticle on, that red bit is very easy to pick up. It is a good compromise, and it also provides some magnification so that if I want to shoot further, like I said, maybe shooting a deer out to 200 yards, I can actually accomplish that. It is a good compromise kind of thing. It's not really super great for long distance because it doesn't have super high magnification, and it's also not great for super close in because the magnification does kind of mess with that a little bit. It's usually, if you want to be fast close in and what people would call close quarters, a close quarter combat scenario, you usually don't want any magnification at all. You just want to be able to see the target as it is. But it's fairly low magnification. It's only 2x. So there is some distortion, but it's not super bad. And also another thing with prism scopes is that they tend to be very, very, very clear. They're actually even clearer than the red dot sights, because the red dots, like I showed you, have that lens on them that is semi-reflective. And so not all the light gets through that, and so it kind of tints the background. Prism scopes, on the other hand, there's going to be a little bit of tinting. Whenever you have light passing through things, you're always going to get a little bit of distortion. But especially for the cost, prism scopes tend to be very, very, very clear. And so I can kind of run it like a red dot. It's good for people with astigmatism. The battery life is not super awesome, but still going to be more than a year for me, which is basically what my requirement is. I don't want to have to change the battery more than once a year. I can use it at longer ranges if I need to. It's a good compromise for me. Will it be a good compromise for you? Maybe, maybe not. That depends on your scenario, but for me, that wound up being the good compromise. And that kind of gives away the thing. And then the other two categories of sights are variable optics, and they can be classified as high power variable optics and low power variable optics. This is a particular example of what I would call a high power variable optic. They're what most people think of when they think of scopes. And the reason why I call it a high power is simply because the magnification doesn't go all the way down to 1. You can't see the target just as you would normally see it with this optic. You're stuck with a fairly high magnification level. This particular one is a 4 to 12 by 40, meaning that the magnification runs from 4x up to 12x, 4 times larger up to 12 times larger, and then the by 40 at the end tells you how big the objective lens is. These ones are really great for distance shooting, but they have a very clear and obvious problem. Let me go ahead and try to show you guys the reticle in there. You can see the crosshairs in there, but you'll notice that it doesn't show up nearly as well as the other ones do in low lighting levels. Now, if you have some kind of other source of light, perhaps you put a flashlight on the gun, which is a good idea, you can get around that, but most people do not find these overly intuitive to use in, use in close quarters type scenarios. Now, if you go to the low power options, the LPVOs as they're called, this one would be an HPVO, high power variable optic. The LPVOs, the low power ones, they can go all the way down to 1, and so they're going to look a little bit clearer when you look through them, and they can kind of help bridge the gap as well. Personally, I'm not a fan of either the HPVOs or the LPVOs because they take up a lot of space. They tend to be fairly long optics. The LPVOs, the low power variable optics, they're not as long, but they're still pretty long, especially compared to a prism scope. Here's a prism scope that does offer some magnification, not a ton, but some magnification, and you'll see that the size comparison is extremely starkly different. And this particular scope by itself only weighs about 11 ounces. This one weighs about 19 ounces. Now it's much more powerful and it's going to be much more precise, but for what I'm doing, which is mostly geared around plinking, personal defense, and maybe hunting, but at that no more than 200 yards, this is overkill for me. Now, if you're someone who is setting up a multi-role rifle primarily for hunting and primarily hunting at longer ranges, say 600 yards and beyond or 800 yards and beyond, high power variable optic is going to be the way to go. It all depends on what your roles are. All right, so those are the 6 basic kinds of optics. There are the conventional open sights, which usually don't work very well in low lights, and especially if you put them against a dark background. And if you have vision issues like I do, you might not even be able to see the front sight. That's an issue. The second type of sighting system is the red dot system. These tend to be very simple to use. They have good battery life. A lot of them that are on the market in the $200 and up category are actually relatively rugged, not super. There are definitely brands that are better than others. For example, Aimpoint is a very good brand that has a good reputation for reliability. But even these HoloSuns are decent enough. They're simple to use, have good battery life. They can be used in a variety of lighting conditions against a variety of backgrounds. They don't provide any magnification in and of themselves. You can put what is called a magnifier behind them, but in and of themselves they don't offer any magnification. So they're usually better for close in stuff than they are far away. And me, I have astigmatism, and that tends to make these dots appear much wider than they actually are, and so it's very hard for me to get really accurate hits out at distance. After that would be holographic sights, which are similar to red dot sights, but they're a little bit clearer. And the disadvantage with them is that they're usually larger, they're more expensive, and they don't usually quite have the battery life, and so a lot of people don't wind up going with holographic sights. They really are better in terms of how they actually look, but the downsides a lot of times kind of outweigh the upsides. And then the next category from that was the prism scopes, which for me was a good balance of the things that I need. Since I have astigmatism, I can't use red dot sights out at distance very well. But prism scopes work really well for people who have astigmatism, so I can get much better shots at distance with one of these. Also, prism scopes do not tend to be overly large, so they don't take up a lot of space on the gun. And this one is a low enough magnification level that I can still use it close in and actually still get some decent shots at distance with it as well. This particular one has a fairly bright reticle that I can use basically like a red dot sight close up. And it also has a pretty decent battery life, 20,000 hour battery life. Like I said, for me, I usually cut that in half, and that's functional, so it's at least a year. It's a good balance for me. And then there are the LPVOs and the HPVOs. This particular one is an HPVO. It's a high power variable optic because the magnification level starts at 4. If the magnification level starts at 1, I would say it's an LPVO, a low power variable optic. These can be very, very, very useful for precision shooting, and especially when you're trying to do stuff at range. But the clarity is sometimes going to leave a little bit to be desired, and they don't work very well in low light situations. And if you have an HPVO, they're not going to be very useful at all in a close quarter situation. The LPVOs that go all the way down to 1x, they can be better for close quarter situations, but remember, you're still going to have a certain amount of size sitting on top of the gun. All right. That is all that I have for you guys. I'm sorry that this one went longer than last time and most of the other ones, but I had to get all the information in there. So it is what it is. I'll probably be talking about my particular choice for this particular optic in more detail in the next video, but I wanted you guys to give you guys the overview of basically what its competitors were, so that you had a little bit more context for what I'm going to say specifically about this optic when we get there. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.